Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Talking Points.
We have a loaded show ahead. We'll be discussing the Las Vegas shooting, a Kurdish vote for independence, and the ongoing battle between President Trump and San Juan Mayor Cruz.
This is Talking Points.
We begin tonight with last night's news from Las Vegas, where at least 59 are dead and more than 500 are injured in what's now considered the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. I'm Josh Carney.
And I'm Mike Riccardi. The death toll has risen overnight as hundreds have made their way to the hospital after last night's deadly mass shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. Here's what we know so far. Police responded to reports of a shooting at the Route 91 Country Music Festival just after 10 p.m. last night. A hail of bullets came down over the crowd when a 64-year-old gunman opened fire from the neighboring Mandalay Bay Hotel. The room he fired from overlooked the concert. The identified shooter is now dead. He checked into the hotel last Thursday, and police found 19 rifles in his room on the 32nd floor.
Las Vegas Sheriff Joseph Lombardo is reluctant to call it an act of terrorism as investigators continue to try and understand the shooter's motive. President Trump called the shooting an act of pure evil and is scheduled to visit Las Vegas on Wednesday. Meanwhile, hundreds have headed to blood banks throughout Las Vegas today as lines wrapped around the block to give to victims. Condolences have stretched across the globe and even amongst survivors of former mass shootings, as survivors of the Pulse nightclub shooting of the last year expressed their condolences in a press conference earlier today. The investigation is still ongoing as authorities have made contact with the shooter's ex-wife in an attempt to learn more about the reasons for this tragedy and continue to explore all aspects of this tragedy.
So clearly, we don't know the motive yet of why this shooter did what he did. But I mean, honestly, I'm at a loss for words. I don't know where to go from here because if you look at both sides of the argument, Democrats saying we need gun control, I don't see how you can possibly ban these weapons and have it hold up in the current Supreme Court. Then on the other side, you have people say, well, you know what? The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. We hear that a lot. I'm sorry, but I don't see a good guy with a gun shooting into a 32nd floor window and somehow stopping this man.
And one of the confusing components for people who were there was not only did they not know what it was, where it was coming from, but they weren't sure why authorities weren't firing back. Now, with it being an open-air venue, it had a lot of existential threats that weren't common among a lot of these situations. It wasn't inside a building, it was over it. And it was thus way more vulnerable, and thus the toll of bodies is way higher. But I think it's genuinely unprecedented how there is no paper trail, there is no sort of lead, there is no mental illness, there is no political affiliation that we know of yet. But this shows you that it really can come from everywhere. And when you see this happen, it is kind of shocking.
And we do have officials saying that we can't call this an act of terrorism because they are hesitant to say that because they don't know what exactly his motive was. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of instances, had this shooter been somebody that is non-white, you would have seen a lot of people jumping to the gun and calling it an act of terrorism. So we do have to wait till the motive comes out. We don't know anything, like you said, about this man's state of mental health. That could always be a factor. We can't speculate as to whether or not that played a role. But I mean, going forward from here, I don't know what exactly, how we change things. It seems like this is just bound to happen every couple of months.
Well, that is a terrible statement to be of fact, but on top of that, the worry is compounded by the fact that there is a lack of answers and that there is a lack of motive and that there is a lack of being able to kind of sort this out for what it was. And there really doesn't seem like there is a definitive trail, and that's what authorities are worrying about at this time.
I mean, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're going to continue to monitor this situation. This is something that's not going to be going away.
Absolutely.
After the break, we'll talk tax reform with Talking Points contributor Dan Prager. Some say the new plan Republicans are touting could be the biggest change to the U.S. tax code in modern history. So don't go away.
Hey, look, it's those guys. Are you good? good to drive?
I'm fine.
How many did you have?
I should be fine.
You should be.
Go and step out of the vehicle for me.
See ya, buddy. Good luck. So turns out, buzz driving and drunk driving, they're the same thing, and it costs around $10,000. So not worth it.
Visit aarp.org/caregiving for information on how to provide even better care for the person who wants to care of you.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move. So I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
Last week, the GOP unveiled their long-awaited tax reform plan. People are calling this the biggest change to the tax code in modern history. The proposal could bring massive changes to what people pay in taxes. Talking Points contributor Dan Prager is in studio to tell us what's in the bill and the chances that it gets passed. Dan?
Well, thanks, guys. Like you said, this plan is going to bring huge changes to the tax code if it gets passed, and there's a lot, so I'm just going to get right into it. The most important change is that Trump wants to simplify 7 tax brackets into 3. Now, those rates would be 35, 25, and 12%. Now, those numbers are averages of the old numbers, so this is really big. While that top 1% is seeing a huge 4% decrease in their taxes, you actually see the lowest tax bracket having to pay even more taxes. You do see the upper and lower middle class getting a bit of a decrease, but the one big narrative coming off this bill is that the increase in the lower classes' taxes is compounded by the rich getting this huge tax break. Now, the next big thing to come here is a huge reduction in business taxes. Both the corporate tax and small business tax are reduced by about 15%. That corporate tax would be put below the global average, which could make a lot of businesses want to stay in the U.S. But that is a bit risky. I've seen some estimates that say the reduction will cost the U.S. $1.5 trillion. There's a chance that businesses will make up that difference, but it is risky. The top rate for small businesses would be sent down to 25%, and the Trump administration is working on clauses to make sure that those businesses can't cheat the system for a smaller rate. Some other things the plan does is it doubles the standard deduction. So your first $12,000 of profit go tax-free. If you're a family, that's $24,000. It also eliminates the federal estate tax, something Republicans have wanted for years, and it repeals the minimum tax on the upper class. But the big problem Republicans are facing here is that they don't really have a plan to pay for all these tax decreases. Those costs have to come from somewhere, and Republicans are trying to cut balancing taxes and not increasing the deficit. The plan has no outline to cover the deficits it would create, and that may be the bill's downfall. Republicans have already had problems passing legislation, and this may follow the same pattern. The GOP can only afford 2 defections, and they have to make everyone happy. They have to keep their large tax cuts to keep libertarians like Rand Paul on board, and they need to keep in some key tax breaks to hold on to moderate conservatives like Susan Collins. But their biggest problem may be that they don't have a plan to pay for it. Bob Corker of Tennessee has already said that if the bill adds 1 penny to the deficit, he will vote against it, and many conservatives would likely follow it. Keep an eye on the bill this upcoming week, guys, because this is going to be a big fight, and it could be the fight that makes or breaks Trump.
Thanks, Dan. Well, the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in New York was yesterday, but the Syracuse League of Women Voters say that 100 years later, there's still a lot more to be done. Talking Points reporter Byron Tollefson has more.
Syracuse women celebrated 100 years of getting the right to vote yesterday. However,
we're still not getting people out to vote.
Joan Duran has been a part of the Syracuse League of Women Voters for decades. She's now the director of voter service and tries to boost voter turnout. However, she says that in the Democratic primary for mayor on September 12th, only 21% of Democrats came out to vote.
We're not being heard, and how long has it been since we've had to vote? And we're still very, very short.
Although the league is celebrating 100 years of getting the right to vote, some members say that there's still a lot of work to be done.
And that goes beyond voter turnout. Heather Waters joined last November motivated by the last presidential election. Her job now is membership director, which is to get other women involved.
100 years later, we still don't have wage equity. We do not have equal rights for women in important areas.
The league's oldest former president was at the celebration, named Ellen Agnew, but she wasn't celebrating much. She says she's concerned about getting younger members involved, and she hasn't seen much around.
People in their even early 30s that seem to be very committed to issues.
Now, Agnew has never used social media, but she says that's the key to reaching younger members. The league is planning on purchasing advertisements on Facebook in the near future in order to boost voter turnout.
Figure out what you think should happen and vote, and figure out the process.
The recovery in Puerto Rico continues nearly 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria made landfall. Millions of American citizens on the island need help, and some on the island are questioning the relief efforts from the U.S. government. President Trump maintains that the cleanup has been a success to date, but San Juan Mayor Carmen Cruz is asking for more federal relief. Talking Points contributor Galat Malamed is here to talk about the dispute between the two leaders and explain what it means for U.S.-Puerto Rican relations. Galat, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, is the White House really overselling this relief effort, or is it actually a good relief effort and it's just being overshadowed by President Trump's feud with Mayor Cruz?
Right, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily that they're overselling what they're doing. I just think they have different views. I think in their eyes, what they're doing is enough, and in the eyes of critics, of the eyes of the mayor of San Juan, they're not doing enough. So it's not that they're overselling it, they just have differing views. The FEMA administrator, Brock Long, said that there's all this commotion surrounding this story and it's overshadowing their efforts. Trump he did plan on going to Puerto Rico tomorrow, although we're not sure if that's still happening due to today's events in Las Vegas.
In all of this commotion, though, one of the most talked about subject lines is the Jones Act. Now, what exactly does that mean for the island of Puerto Rico and also relations with the United States?
Right. In the bigger picture, I mean, the Jones Act is a century-old thing. It's a hot topic now due to the hurricane. But before that, basically, it was just making things very expensive to be shipped into Puerto Rico from the U.S. mainland, kind of treating them differently. It was twice as much money to ship from the U.S. mainland to Puerto Rico than from a foreign port to Puerto Rico, even though we have U.S. citizens there. In terms of the hurricane, the Jones Act was lifted for Texas and Florida, actually, before Harvey and Irma hit. But as you know, there was a big public outcry before Trump lifted the Jones Act for Puerto Rico, so it kind of shows how the situations were treated differently.
Now, Puerto Ricans in Florida actually played a pretty large role in helping Donald Trump win that state. And just if you go back last week, a lot were actually thankful for the response up until President Trump started that feud, he didn't particularly start it himself, but got involved in that feud, and he suggested that Puerto Rico was creating their own problems with debt and poor infrastructure. Moving forward, do you think this is a problem that statehood could fix?
You know, I just don't think statehood is very lightly. I think the thing is with statehood, then Puerto Rico has debt that President Trump was talking about. We inherit the debt, the unemployment levels, and I don't think it would necessarily fix the rhetoric towards Puerto Rico by President Trump. The people of Puerto Rico really do want statehood. They voted for it by a large majority, but I don't think it will happen in Congress.
Now, to an average viewer, there has been a tremendous chasm between the coverage of Harvey and Irma and then the coverage of Maria. Why has that been, and is there actually a disproportionate amount of coverage?
Yeah, there actually is a disproportionate amount of coverage. If you look at the charts of the coverage up there, Harvey and Irma, in terms of sentences a day, said about 2,000 sentences a day for them, but Maria was about 500 sentences. So basically what you're saying, and you see in terms of just where it was, Texas and Florida around the thousands, Puerto Rico around 1,005 or 500, basically Texas and Florida got 4 times more coverage than Hurricane Maria, essentially, despite the fact that it is U.S. citizens being affected in Puerto Rico as well as in Florida and Texas. And the National Association of Hispanic Journalists actually called out the media, saying they weren't giving enough coverage to Puerto Rico. And even just looking at who the network sent to Puerto Rico, Lester Holt of NBC was the only one to anchor from Puerto Rico, not the other major networks where they did anchor from Florida during Irma.
We'll be sure to monitor this situation. Thanks a lot for being here.
When we get back, Kurds in Iraq voted to separate from the country, and the international community responds. Stay with us.
Adventure can be found anywhere, but the best place to start is in the forest.
I spy something beginning with S.
Snow?
No.
Snow-covered trees.
Nothing to do with snow.
Head outside to discover incredible animals and beautiful plants that come together to create an unforgettable adventure.
Wow.
So grab your loved ones.
Don't even.
And explore a world of possibilities.
Come on, this way.
Visit discovertheforest.org to find the closest forest or park to you.
Here we go. We're gonna go out there in the rain. You're gonna get wet. All right, here we go. Go, okay, quick. Oh yeah, yes. So much fun. Mwah. We're getting so wet. Oh,
After the people of Kurdistan voted for independence from Iraq in a referendum, the U.S. and Iraq are declaring it illegitimate, and the Kurds' ongoing fight for independence is raising tensions in the region. Here to break down what Kurdish statehood might mean for the Middle East and the world is Talking Points international contributor Elijah Shama. Elijah, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So walk us through this vote. What does this mean for Kurds and their independence?
What this vote basically is in the areas that the Kurdish government already administers. So we're talking about kind of the north of Iraq, next to Syria and Iran. If they want to separate, if they want to be their own entity. So we're talking about Erbil, we're talking about Kirkuk. And according to them, they had about a 90% vote in favor of leaving Iraq. And that's something that Iraq really doesn't want. These are very oil-rich areas and very important parts of the country. And Iraq is very much trying to keep themselves together, especially after kind of a bruising fight with ISIS.
And what can Iraq do for this situation?
Well, they've already kind of started taking measures, and they've kind of escalated their rhetoric as they've gone. But so far, they've canceled all flights into Kurdish-controlled areas. So that is, the airport in Erbil is now closed. And they've started sealing off road access to also Kurdish-controlled areas. We saw the road from Mosul to Kirkuk get closed down. That's a big supply route for the city. So they're starting to try and wall off and surround them. And they haven't really said that they're going to take military action yet, but if necessary, that is an option on the table.
If they're closing airports, if they're considering military action, if it's being marked as illegitimate, how is this raising tensions throughout the region, and could we see a spike?
It's raising tensions throughout the regions because a lot of people don't want the Kurds to have statehood, primarily Turkey. Turkey is very, very wary of Kurdish independence. They have a huge Kurdish population in the southern region of their own country, and they fear that Kurdish independence is just going to lead to more violence in those areas. And on top of that, Iraq is trying to hold themselves together, and a Kurdish state won't make that goal any easier. So that's making it very hard for kind of the definition of the Middle East we know to continue.
And Elijah, what's the international response been to this referendum?
It's been very tepid, and that's been very disheartening to a lot of the Kurds that are already there, because these are very pro-Western people. They really like the U.S., they really like the EU, and to kind of see Secretary of State Rex Tillerson come out and say this was an illegitimate vote, and the EU to say we don't necessarily support this right now, it's very disheartening for them. They worked really hard for them. They felt like they were really good allies in the fight against ISIS. The Peshmerga was vital in taking back parts of Mosul and parts of northern Iraq, and they kind of feel like they've been left out to dry now.
Well, Elijah, thank you for your insight, and we'll certainly be following it.
After months of investigations into mysterious sonic attacks on U.S. diplomats, the U.S. State Department is pulling out all families of employees and non-essential personnel from Cuba. Talking Points contributor Sabrina Maggiore joins us to discuss what this means for U.S.-Cuban relations moving forward. Sabrina, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what exactly are these sonic attacks, and what do we know about them so far?
Yeah, so far we know 21 U.S. diplomats and family members have been affected by these sonic attacks. The AP actually came out with a report today that said intelligence operatives were actually among the chief people targeted in these attacks, which is new and sort of adds this new dimension to the story. In terms of the symptoms of these attacks, we're seeing symptoms that sort of coincide with concussions. We're seeing brain trauma, hearing loss, nosebleeds, and headaches. And in addition to this, the devices themselves haven't actually been found. We don't know who perpetrated the attacks, and Cuba is saying that it has no knowledge of how these attacks came to be either.
Outside of pulling out diplomats, how has the United States responded?
Essentially, the U.S. has said that there's going to be a 60% staff reduction in the embassy there. The U.S. is also not going to be issuing visas to Cubans attempting to go to the United States anymore. It's also issuing a travel warning to U.S. citizens who would like to go to Cuba. And Marco Rubio and other government officials have come out and said that they doubt Cuba has no knowledge of this. So there's been a sort of reluctance there to sort of take Cuba's word at face value.
Now, during the Obama era, we were sort of warming relations with Cuba, and President Trump on the campaign trail was not as warm, but we have seen a continuation of these policies thus far, with perhaps future plans to change it. But how do these sonic attacks affect relations moving forward?
Yeah, so there's certainly been heightened rhetoric that we've seen coming out of this attack. We've seen Trump address the UN General Assembly and say that he expects to sort of keep going with sanctions on Cuba until it makes some fundamental changes in its human rights sort of norms. But in addition to that, under Obama, you kind of mentioned that we saw these opening of relations. We saw 50 years worth of travel restrictions opening up, and we're seeing sort of a reluctance to continue these policies from the Trump administration.
Now, of the diplomats who were removed, what has their reaction been?
Many of the diplomats are actually not in favor of leaving the embassy. They're saying that this is coming at a time where Raul Castro is about to step down from power, and they're saying that it's important that they stay there and sort of continue essentially ensuring that, you know, good policies and good relations continue there.
Mm-hmm. Sabrina, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we'll talk about the stories you missed last week. We'll be right back.
This is the story of a boy who didn't talk for a long time. The boy liked things to always be the same. Any changes would scare and upset him. The unknown was an unfriendly place. The boy was very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. He wasn't trying to be mean, it just made him feel uncomfortable. Sometimes he would flap his arms again and again.
One day, I found out I have something called autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I found my voice and learned all the ways I could live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
Maybe he's really focused.
Maybe he likes spinning the wheels.
Maybe he just loves trucks.
Preoccupation with objects is one early sign of autism. Learn the others today.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. This is a serious problem, but one we can solve. Visit feedingamerica.org to help. Together we can solve hunger. Together we're feeding America.
Some stories inevitably do not capture the mainstream attention they deserve. This week on Talking Points, we have economic changes between North America's biggest powers and a potential resurgence of the Islamic State. The United States government enacted a tariff on Canadian airline Bombardier last week during the third round of NAFTA trade negotiations. The existing tariff will be increased by over 200% on airlines made by Bombardier. The tariff was enacted at the request of American airliner Boeing. The U.S. Commerce Department explained that the tariff was being raised after Canada and Quebec failed to subsidize Boeing properly in comparison to Bombardier.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reacted angrily to the tariff, calling it completely unfounded and without merit. Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland said that the move was an example of protectionism by the U.S. government. Furthermore, the U.S. demanded the elimination of Chapter 19 in NAFTA. Chapter 19 allows a company like Bombardier to challenge a government's action against it. President Trump has spoken repeatedly on the U.S.'s potential withdrawal from NAFTA, which was one of his long-term goals in his campaign. The United States will host the fourth round of negotiations starting next Wednesday. While Americans' forces and their allies have made progress in the Middle Eastern campaign, ISIS remains a threat. Last week, the group released a recording of their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The recording is the first message from al-Baghdadi since November of last year. Since that time, Western forces have seized Mosul, Iraq, and much of the group's capital in Raqqa, Syria. Al-Baghdadi praises his troops in the recording and emphasizes the threat of the Islamic State poses to the Western world. Russian officials said that al-Baghdadi was killed in a strike launched in May. However, U.S. officials cast doubt on the report almost immediately afterwards.
2 attacks over the weekend are being investigated in connection with the Islamic State. In Marseille, France, 2 women were fatally stabbed before the attacker was killed by police yesterday. The Islamic State publicly claimed responsibility for the attack. Meanwhile, in Edmonton, Canada, 4 people were injured after a Somali-born refugee drove a truck into a crowd on Saturday. Although the Islamic State did not claim responsibility, paraphernalia was discovered in the vehicle's back seat. Canadian authorities have classified the incident as an act of terrorism.
To end the show, we'll discuss the stories you should be following in the weeks ahead. Stay with us.
Look at you. You're at the top of your game. You're unstoppable. Nothing can throw you off track. Wait, is that your car? Uh-oh. Yeah, I saw that coming. That will throw you off track. You're looking at around 10 grand in fines, legal fees, and increased insurance rates. Let's try this again. Smart move. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
The chaos that has ensued over the referendum for Catalan independence is telling. Both parties stand to gain and stand to lose regardless of the outcome, and frustrations are clearly riding high. The critical question that Spain's leaders and the Catalonian government are asking themselves is, can the region sustain itself on its own, and how will Spain fare as a result? Catalonia accounts for 20% of Spain's economic productivity and a quarter of the country's exports. The region is also responsible for over 20% of the country's tax base and home to a third of all foreign corporations currently doing business in Spain. Their exclusive economic prowess does raise concerns if they were to split and join the international stage as a separate nation. Spain's fiscal stability is in dire straits and losing a tremendous amount if its tax base and economic activity would emphasize dramatic uncertainties. The national fiscal implications are not the only concerns. If the Catalan referendum reaches a decisive yes vote without the quote-unquote disruption by the national government, and the European Union also recognizes Catalonia as independent, the decision will impact the fiscal stability of the continent as well. According to the research director at City Index, the euro is expected to decline, and not just by a hair, but up to 5% if Catalan is eventually able to declare outright independence.
That's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you. Good night.